I'll use Ohio as a good example. Ohio has gone from having unemployment greater than the national average to below the national average. That's the state as a whole. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Ohio and I worked there in television and in radio. I reported on steel mill closings in Youngstown. 50,000 jobs disappeared. And I decided after that experience to go to business school to find out how business really worked and how business people made decisions. So I left Ohio and I moved to New York. But back home in Northeast Ohio, the area is no longer the prosperous place where I grew up and where it was great to raise a family. Now, when you drive through my hometown, Warren, street after street has abandoned houses. Actually, they're starting to use some mortgage settlement money to buy up those abandoned houses and tear them down, which is a good idea because then you have more parkland, it's safer, and you have less supply. One of the houses were going for $10,000. I mean, a real house. And sometimes you couldn't find a buyer for that, and that's why they ended up abandoned and foreclosed and abandoned. In the area, Packard Electric was a big employer, which became Delphi. Lots of those jobs moved to Mexico. Delphi went bankrupt. GM was a big employer in the area as well as the steel mills. The revitalized GM decided to build the Chevy Cruze in Lordstown, which is basically adjacent to my hometown. And now there are 3 shifts working again in Lordstown. So that's one of the signs of real turnaround that's happening in that area. The other one is that Utica shale was discovered in the area. And so the gas companies are buying up drilling rights. I have a family friend who works in a bank and talks about people bringing in big checks from having sold their drilling rights, basically. And they're buying cars and tractors and other things. But it's not only that. There's a local steel mill that has actually doubled in size because it's building pipe for the wells in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. And this is close to the border of Pennsylvania, so it's geographically contiguous, basically. Also, trucking companies are hiring because they need to be carrying the pipe and everything else for the drilling. So for the first time, there really is a turnaround happening in the economy, and that turnaround will impact voters in Ohio, and Ohio is one of the keys to the election. Nationally, there are signs of a turnaround as well. Manufacturing jobs are beginning to return to the U.S. as labor costs increase in China and as companies see the downside of just-in-time sourcing when you need something and it's not there, then some companies are beginning to bring some of their manufacturing back to the U.S. So far, the turnaround is tenuous, so as an added insurance policy, the Federal Reserve has promised to keep rates down and to help with the healing process for the economy. And recently, the Federal Reserve announced that it was going to be buying up long-term mortgages in order to push mortgage rates even lower than where they are now. A lot of business people and pundits thought that this decision was an indication from the Federal Reserve that it expected another recession immediately. In fact, what I hear is that the Federal Reserve is willing to do whatever it takes to keep the economy going, and that, in fact, the insurance policy is against the possibility that Congress doesn't get its fiscal house in order in time. So that's the fiscal cliff, which is something that I do worry about. That's in January. And I've heard a couple interesting things about fiscal cliff possibilities from some pretty smart hedge fund people. One scenario is after the election, the president gets everybody together, butts heads, and they actually come up with a solution for the budget and the debt, and it looks something like Simpson-Bowles, which basically the administration has moved away from up till now. But that's one scenario. Another scenario is that Congress allows the fiscal cliff to be triggered, and we actually go over it for a couple days. The advantage of this is a little convoluted, but it's interesting, is that the Congress members that have signed the pledge with Grover Norquist that they will not raise taxes would be able to vote for a tax decrease of what automatically goes into effect, which is an increase, and they still keep the pledge. Interesting, right? So you'd still end up with higher taxes than where you are now, but lower than what's triggered automatically by the fiscal cliff. So who knows? But those are two interesting scenarios that are out there, and people are making bets on. Look, I'm not naive. I know there are risks that bear watching. I know that some of them could push us into recession again. I do worry about the fiscal cliff, and what I worry about is that the politicians decide to play chicken with our future, and then, and it's kind of too late. I do think that we need to tackle our debt and our deficit. That is the heavy lifting after the election. There's some talk about it in the election, but it definitely is something that has to be done. But I think we have time, and I think if we have the will, we will find the way. When I'm in a group of top business leaders talking about this, they believe that the solutions are not that difficult, but that any solutions do require both tax increases and spending cuts, and there's no way to get around it without doing both. Europe is a wild card, so is the Middle East. I do worry about Iran, but all of these worries are already in the market. So any pleasant surprises would actually push things higher. Overall, I'm an optimist, you might be able to tell, that I think we're finally on the road to recovery. As I said in the beginning, it's a long road, and some things have changed along the way. I talked to CEOs who say that they're much more automated now than they were before the recession, and some of the jobs that were lost just won't be coming back.